plan is to have a mix of substantive legal updates as well as practical advice through this Dentons Academy webinar series. And this webinar falls more into the latter category, as we'll primarily be discussing cybersecurity and DIBCAC assessments with a few of our panelists that have recently gone through high-level assessments and have been communicating with DCMA on the topic. On that note, I'd like to thank and introduce our panelists. The first is Elizabeth Pinsino. Elizabeth is an attorney at United Launch Alliance, and her work at ULA includes legal issues related to the supply chain, compliance with prime contracts, flow downs, and cybersecurity. Elizabeth works closely with the ULA Information Security team to develop internal policies and procedures related to cybersecurity, particularly at the supplier level. Prior to joining ULA, Elizabeth worked as an associate with us at Dentons as a member of our government contracts practice group. So it's great to see her and have her be a part of our panel today. Our next panelist is Sylvia Gaffney. Sylvia serves as an Associate General Counsel Compliance for Viasat Government Systems, where she provides legal transaction and compliance support for Viasat Supply Chain Government Contracts Group and shares responsibility for managing Viasat's federal cybersecurity compliance with Jeff Bauer, who's our next panelist. Jeff is Viasat's Government Products and Services Segment Lead for Cybersecurity, Risk Management, and Compliance. He has over 20 years of IT cybersecurity experience within the government and commercial enterprise environments, and in recent years, he's been directly involved in Viasat's implementation of DFARS 252.204.7012, NIST 800-171, and the near-term CMMC technical and non-technical requirements through Viasat's enterprise environment. Rounding out our panel today is Dentons Government Contracts partner Phil Seckman, who I've had the privilege to work with on a variety of government contracts matters, but as related to this panel, a number of cybersecurity compliance assessments, the creation of cybersecurity-related policies, procedures, CUI marking issues, cyber incident reporting disclosures, and the list goes on. So thank you all for joining us today. The agenda for today's discussion, let me get there, is to first provide a 10-minute or so overview of the cybersecurity regulations that will provide the foundation for the discussion today. We'll then spend much of the time today discussing DIBCAC assessments, including preparing for them, things that were raised or surprised our panelists during their assessment, and the continuing process after the assessment. After the discussion on DIBCAC assessments, we'll turn to CMMC, and then if we have time, we'll close out the discussion with considerations based on cybersecurity breaches reported in the news and a Q&A. However, rather than waiting till the end, we welcome questions at any time, and if you put them in the comment box, I'll try my best to work them in as topics are being discussed. So, finally, prior to getting started with the material, I have to take care of one CLE housekeeping item regarding CLE credit. The webinar window must remain open for the entirety of the program, and it must be the only window on the forefront of your screen. WebEx does detect if you minimize the program or use the computer outside of the webinar software, and that will prevent you from earning CLE credit. One other important note is if you have a New York or New Jersey license, please be sure to listen for the code word given during the program. When prompted, you will need to enter that code word into the Q&A section of the screen, and if you don't have a New York or New Jersey license, you don't need to worry about this. So with all of that said, I'm happy to get into the material today, and on that note, I will ask Phil, to set the stage for the conversation today, can you please provide us with an abbreviated overview of the cybersecurity framework applicable to government contractors?
Certainly, Tyler, and thank you. I note that Tyler emphasized abbreviated. He knows how I can tend to chat for a while, so I will do my best. Before that, just wanted to say welcome to everybody. I went through the RSVP list and saw a number of folks that whose names I recognized, and excited to have you here with us today. And if we don't answer your questions, please feel free to follow up with us. So starting with a little bit of background, folks on the phone or on the webinar may be familiar with this stuff, so I apologize if we're rehashing a little bit, but I do think it's helpful to set the table for what we're talking about. So you can pick kind of any year within the last probably 30 to 40 years as being kind of a beginning pivot point in terms of cybersecurity concerns, but it really, in terms of the background that led to the rule and the framework we're dealing with now, I think begins with Executive Order 13556, which was, the creation of a consolidated approach to marking information that needed to be protected and kept confidential within the government, and designated NARA as the executive agent for the creation and management of the CUI program. Following its designation, NARA issued finally in 2016 its final regulations for the CUI program, and in parallel with that was working with NIST as well as DoD to define the security controls for non-federal systems and organizations that were going to be used as the contractual baseline to define what adequate security was going to mean for purposes of contractor information systems or non-federal information systems. The NIST 800-171 controls are largely a subset of the controls from NIST 800-53, as well as the Federal Information Processing materials. And the NIST special publication has gone through a number of revisions since 2015 and is currently on revision 2, which was published finally January 28th, 2021, with some minor modifications, but came out actually in March, I think, of 2020. And its purpose is to recommend the security requirements for protecting confidentiality of CUI that's resident on a non-federal system, and defines the various security controls that we're going to be talking about, and that DCMA is now assessing in the context of DIBCAC, and that provides the beginning, the foundation for the Level 3 CMMC certification. So turning to the next slide, real quickly, the requirements in NIST 800-171 set forth 14 families. Obviously not going to dig into the details here. Each family has specific security requirements, those that are basic and then derived as two sort of categories within each of the security requirements, totaling to more than 110, or it's about 110, I think, in total requirements. And it's a blend of policy and procedure. And I think that blend is what counsels in favor of a really coordinated effort between different functional areas within the organization to accomplish compliance and complete implementation of the NIST controls. You document how you've done this through your system security plan, and to the extent you have any issues with full implementation, you would address those through plans of action and milestones, or POAMs, that are going to identify when you're going to have implementation completed. NIST has also published additional materials to help contractors perform self-assessments, and we'll talk about that as well in the context of the new rules, the interim rule that is really the main focus of the discussion today. So let's turn to the next slide, Tyler. So building on the 800-171 requirements in the NARA rule, DoD in the same year, 2015, published the DFARS Safeguarding for Covered Defense Information, or CDI clause. It's kind of how I refer to it for short. This rule replaced what was previously the Uncontrolled Classified Technical Information, or UCTI clause, that had come out in 2013 and had required contractors for that period to implement a subset of 800-53 controls. The DoD then pivoted in 2015-2016 to what we find today, which is the CDI clause. And it really requires three main things. The contractor has to provide adequate security on all covered contractor information systems. It has to provide rapid reporting of any cyber incidents, and there's a centralized avenue for reporting to DoD so that all of it can go into one central funnel, and DoD can monitor trends and also conduct any forensic analysis. And then the third issue is flowing down the requirement to subcontractors, recognizing that this risk associated with the protection of CUI is really an issue all the way down the supply chain. For those with the clause, compliance was required as soon as practicable, but no later than December 31st, 2017. I think because of the DoD IG audit that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, as well as what we're seeing in terms of the DIBCAC reviews, there's clear recognition that there's a very large swath of the DoD industrial base that has either not read the rule or has not fully implemented the controls. So, while compliance was required by December 31st, there's probably a fair number of contractors that have not achieved compliance, and there's really an urgency around getting past that place. On the issue of marking, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I just wanted to note that DoD has updated its instruction 5200.48 to establish the DoD CUI policy, and that came out in March 2020. So the clause requires these three things, and then how are you signaled that that requirement is going to apply to your contract? There is a solicitation provision, which is the next slide, and that's 252.204-7008, which requires the contractor to represent that by submission of their offer, they have or will implement the security controls in NIST 800-171 applicable on the date of award of the contract. The risk associated with noncompliance here should be relatively clear. If you affirmatively represent that you have implemented compliance, but you haven't, there is the risk of allegations of fraud, as well as termination for default, suspension and debarment, and other bad consequences that can come along with failing to appropriately adhere to the requirements associated with this clause. And it is a very hot button issue for the government. Over the last couple of years, they're very focused on this and making sure that they raise everybody's game when it comes to cybersecurity. And that's enforcement avenue is one of the mechanisms that they are going to use to do it. And then in addition to the DoD implementation that we see, in 2016, the FAR Council also issued the Basic Safeguarding Rule. This covers a different set of materials known as federal contract information that's defined different than covered defense information. The clause is less onerous than the NIST Special Publication 800-171 controls, and really is analogous to Level 1 certification of CMMC. There's no reporting requirement associated with this clause either. Now, we are expecting that this clause is likely to be removed or significantly revised when the NARA FAR rule is promulgated. That FAR case has been pending, however, for we're going on 4 years now. The DAR Council notified the FAR staff that it had agreed to the proposed rule, and they're now awaiting the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council. So every year I say, I think it's going to come this year, and then I get tricked, and I feel a little bit like Lucy in the football, but hopefully we will see that rule come out this year. And I think it will apply the NIST 800-171 requirements across a much broader swath of civilian contractors. So we'll see how that shapes up. And that is by no means a comprehensive overview of the regulatory landscape that contractors are facing, but it's a good way to set the table for the discussion today. for DIBCAC reviews.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Phil. So we've made our way to the DIBCAC assessments, but you're not off the hook yet. Prior to getting into some of the war stories with the rest of our panelists that have gone through those high-level assessments, hoping you can refresh everyone on the new provision and clause and the 3 levels of the DIBCAC assessment.
Certainly. So first, sort of what were the developments that led to the interim rule that we're dealing with today? The first was a memo published December 2018 that provided contract language for the government to include in statements of work or procedurals, the contract deliverable requirements list, allowing access to and requiring delivery of the contractor's SSP and the contractor's plan to flow down covered defense information and assess compliance of Tier 1 suppliers. Essentially a recognition at DoD that they needed to do a better job of assessing compliance and the risk associated with cybersecurity all the way down the supply chain, and also recognizing the plain language of the DFARS clause we just talked about just requires that you flow the clause down. It doesn't include anything about how they're going to confirm compliance with implementation. There's no sort of certification regime or anything like that beyond the representation that's made. And then we got the 2 LORD memos, the first coming out in January of 2019, which tasked DCMA with validating contractors' NIST compliance in the context of CPSRs. And many of you may have already encountered that. The details of the inquiry are identified in the CPSR guidebook that DCMA issues, and I have encountered it in a number of different CPSRs that I've assisted with. But that's kind of checking on how you're flowing it down to your subcontractors. In addition to that, DCMA was directed to identify methods to assess the contractor's SSP and do it strategically, meaning not contract by contract. And that memo really triggered, I think, and informs the approach that we see in the DIBCAC interim rule that we're going to deal with here in a second. And I've already talked about the DoD IG audit, but it basically found that assessing contractor compliance as part of source selection criteria is an important approach to dealing with this issue, recognizing that very significant percentages of contractors had not implemented the security controls or weren't completely up to snuff when it came to the requirements of the NIST SP 800-171 requirements. So what did we get as a result of that? We got the interim rule, which is effective as of November 30th, 2020. And this rule adds 3 new parts to the DFARS. The first 2, a provision and a clause, relate to the DIBCAC assessments, and I'll talk about the third when we get to CMMC. In the context of DIBCAC, it establishes 3 levels of assessments, basic, medium, and high. The basic assessment is a contractor self-assessment, which will leverage the NIST 800-171A materials that I referred to earlier, and then the contractor enters this information into SPRS regarding their cage, depending on how many different contractor information systems they have. But it basically gives a low confidence for the government. But, contractors can ensure that they're going to be eligible for awards going forward or option exercises by doing this, as well as subcontractors. The medium and high is more of what we'll be getting some high in particular, some insight into here. But these are DoD conducted reviews of the implementation of the information system security requirements. The assessment includes a scoring template that identifies the NIST requirements in terms of a score. The best score you can get is 110, and from there you kind of get deductions based on your implementation status. and you can end up with a very significantly negative score if you haven't implemented everything in accordance with the rule. So with that, Tyler, I think we're kind of ready to begin some discussion about experiences that folks have had actually going through DIBCAC reviews and how DoD is approaching this issue. I'll toss it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Phil. And I'm going to pose the next question to Jeff. Jeff, can you provide us with some insight on how Viasat prepared for its high-level DIBCAC assessment and what messaging you received from DCMA in advance of that assessment?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the intro earlier. Yeah, definitely happy and glad to be here to talk about this and share a lot of the information. So, definitely what you see on the screen, the DIBCAC assessments, all of the basic variables that you need in order to go through an assessment. But kind of just starting out where you kind of started that question is just that is, we had pretty good well in advance information, which I think going back to December of December of 2019 was when they first started reaching out to us, and they said, hey, we want to come out in, I think it was like March, April, or maybe May timeframe. We want to do our assessment. I think pretty much by their standard, they're going to give you 90 days notice. But because of COVID, then that started kicking off, so we ended up pushing it to the right a little bit more. So we ended up executing in July of 2020 and starting it off there. But like I said, we had 90 days notice. So, for the most part, enough time to kind of get things going, as the expectation is that, you're not just starting from square one at that point, which, there's probably a lot of companies that probably still are or still were at that time. But, kind of just coming into some of the things that we did for preparation is, there's definitely some good, pieces just to look at, kind of just things to think about is that, I won't just present like the polished rock advice to be like, oh, you should do this, you should do that. We certainly had our share of mistakes in preparation. We didn't do everything perfect, but the first adage that's, first and foremost is get all of your stakeholders involved. We knew that prior to the DIBCAC assessment, especially just the implementation of the DFARS and NIST requirements. But definitely for the DIBCAC assessment, you need to get all of your stakeholders, all of the players involved from all vectors of your company, from legal, from supply chain, from operations to your various programs, to all of your IT folks, cybersecurity folks, even down to your your HR related folks and so on. And, the list definitely doesn't stop there, but just to throw some different vectors out there. Again, gaining as many stakeholders as possible, you're preparing for it, especially preparing for the assessment is, thinking about like the interview questions that are going to come out and preparing those stakeholders for that, because, I'm probably one of the chief authors and architects to our system security plan, although I'm not the only one. But when the DIBCAC comes in, they don't want to just hear me talk about it. They want to hear the stakeholders who are actually executing to make sure what's on that SSP and what's on our policies is definitely what's being implemented, and so on and so on. So, you want to identify all those stakeholders, prepare them for the interviews without question. And, you want to do that because when you're going through the assessment, you don't want DIBCAC to be the ones being like, hey, can we talk to this person? Can we talk to that person? Good due diligence and preparation shows that you have the right parties involved, and so on and so on. And if they're the ones constantly asking for, hey, I need this, can I see this, can I talk to that person? I think that kind of just sets it up where it's like, hey, maybe you weren't completely prepared for this, and maybe that just causes them to want to just peel back the onion and, even more, for no other way to say, and things like that. There's always a question that comes out is, as I've sat through some of these too, is like how many total hours were needed. And I don't know how many total hours were needed. It was, I was joking with Sylvia about this before, but it took a plethora. And, probably one of the lessons learned is we've been going back to a lot of the DFARS and NIST stuff that we were implementing years ago, but relative to the DIBCAC assessment is that we're doing now is we're starting to track our hours better to know that, hey, what is it really taking, and what is it taking from various teams in terms of hours, so we can have like a pretty good tactical and operational and strategic level understanding as far as where our efforts are going and how much it's going to take for the long-term, continuous long-term effort. Because this isn't just a, one-time assessment. CMMC is coming, but CMMC will be ongoing. And in the real focus here is, although we're focused on compliance frameworks, we're really focused on security models and, security implementation in the end. So it's like that security is everyone's responsibility. So just that continuous and ongoing piece. But, just as I was saying, is getting the stakeholders involved is, I'd say this is, get a good project plan associated with what you want to do. And, I think we probably had a pretty good project plan, although there was definitely some gaps in there that we kind of maybe took a little bit of an ad hoc approach just because we were moving so fast and so on. But as you get those stakeholders involved, having a good project plan about who's going to be doing what and, less of an ad hoc approach. And, we've started to nail a lot of those things down, and we've gotten better at that over the time, but definitely from like a project planning and task tracking and who's doing what and making sure it's get done and hitting timelines and so on. I can't tell you how your company is going to do that. And, irrelevant of whether you're a small, medium, or large company, it's just something that's absolutely needed. Another big piece for us for preparation was just leaving no stone unturned. And, I know there's still a lot of questions in regards to like controlled and classified information and CUI and so on, but just really looking and taking a hard look and, asking the tough questions from a due diligence perspective is like, hey, where does CUI go in our company? And, the easy CUI is like the stuff that's marked, or maybe it's not marked, like with the legacy FUO stuff prior to like the 5200.48 DoD instruction that recently came out. But with that being said, is understanding where your CUI is going. Like I said, the easy stuff to identify is the marked stuff. What about all the stuff like metadata type stuff, like R&D type stuff and software type stuff, and then, and repositories that have analysis of different variables that's going on within your program and so on, in addition to, just snippets of different information that come on from database perspective and so on and so on. So, again, it takes a village to do this, and to say like, hey, the IT person, it's like all vectors within IT and cybersecurity from a database perspective, applications, endpoint, network. Obviously, that goes without saying, but just to say that. Another good thing to think about as you roll it. Oh, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought.
Yeah, I was just the last thing I wanted to say was from a system security plan perspective is, and there's not everyone's probably seen this, is there's no format for your system security plan. There are some companies that I've worked with and talked to, and it's like they have the most detailed system security plans. That thing's 150 pages, or if not more. There's other companies that I work with, and it's a 10-page system security plan. However, though, the more details you have potentially up front, the less maybe questions and RFIs that are going to get thrown at you. As you prepare for the assessment and you work with DIBCAC, they're going to get your system security plan in advance, and even the days prior, they're going to say, hey, when we show up based on your system security plan, this is what we want to see. So the more information you have and you can share, you'll probably get less questions and less RFIs initially. The less details you have in your system security plan, definitely you're going to get a lot of RFIs. I'd say we probably fell somewhere in the middle. Our system security plan is pretty detailed, although we probably leave a lot of stuff just because having that constant documentation. But I think the one thing we learned from this is we learned that we wanted to have a better and different style of system security plan. So we kind of automated some of it in addition from like the artifact collection and how we're presenting it. So we have a really standard format, which allows our presenters and the interviewees who are our stakeholders to actually go on and use that system security plan as the presenting tool and so on. So we use some specific a specific tool, which I'll call it like a governance, risk management, and compliance tool, a GRC tool, although it's not specifically that, but that's kind of what we turned it into. So that was kind of nice. And I know I said that was my last thing. The one last thing I'll say, which was key, is the 800-171 alpha document that's referenced. Use that because the assessors, those are the objectives that they focus on 100%. They're going to go right down that objective list, and they're going to say, okay, let's talk about this and let's talk about that. And as soon as they hit those objectives, the next thing they're going to say is, okay, show me where it exists in your policy. So although kind of the policy piece has always kind of been a relatively unwritten or just inferred piece with 800-171 and the previous DFARS clause, for CMMC, obviously, it goes without saying that you have to have that maturity capability, but definitely as you go through it and you say you display and show the artifacts for your technical implementation or do a demonstration, the next thing they say is show me where it's documented, and you have to produce that and so on. So those are kind of like the quick things that I'll say to it. If there's, see if anybody has any questions from those, if you want me to go into anything else in detail.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely helpful and, a lot of insight there for everyone. And one thing that I wanted to latch on was, the team mentality and getting all the stakeholders involved. And really on that point, I guess I'll throw this question to Elizabeth. Can you help us understand from the legal role how in-house counsel can participate in the preparation and what your focus was on in preparing for the DIBCAC review?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that really helped us in preparation for this review and all of our IT-related audits is that we have an information security risk board. We're certified to ISO 27001, and so that's something we're familiar with, those regular audits. So we have the information security risk board, and IT security is the owner of that, but we've already got, HR, data management, supply chain, legal are part of that. So we're working together to identify risk, talk policies, talk how our command media matches up to the controls throughout the year and not just in preparation for the DIBCAC assessment. So I think that's really helpful. In terms of preparing for the specific assessment that came up, IT security, again, largely took the lead, but one of the primary roles for legal is in the command media front, making sure that all of the things that we're doing, that we do actually have policies in place that describe what we're doing. And so in some cases we do, in some cases there was an opportunity to look at those, refine those, and then also just to make sure that the various different command media owners, whether that's information security or HR, supply chain, are up to date on their policies. Some of them they may not have looked at for a while since they were last updated. So that's one of the roles that I have, and I think just another thing we did is I coordinated reaching out to one of our suppliers who'd already been through a DIBCAC review, and they were willing to help us out, providing us some advice on their experience, similar to what Jeff just provided everyone here, but sort of one-on-one so that we had that insight. And then just working closely with IT security to make sure that where they've got questions, we're able to answer, and then the extent that there's training or marking or policy issues that legal needs to get involved in, that we're working very closely, again, throughout the year, but particularly in the run-up to that.
Yeah, and I guess one follow-up question for you. As lawyers, most of us, we can read the clauses and understand generally what's required, but don't generally understand the technology and all of those pieces that go into it. So I was, curious on how you got up to speed and or, would essentially kick the tires to test the compliance ahead of a DIBCAC assessment to ensure that, all of the stakeholders are comfortable that everything's in place to the greatest extent possible and you're prepared for that assessment.
Yeah, so, again, I think one thing that helps is just that I work very closely with our information security team, so there's still some of the controls that I can't profess to fully understand, but as you have the kind of walkthroughs and you look at how does our command media and how do our processes match up to these controls, and you hear the actual subject matter experts speak to that, then you develop a level of confidence that they know what they're talking about, and I developed a very, very low level of understanding of the controls. I do actually read the controls, so I won't say that that all of them make sense to my legal brain, but I do read them just so that to the extent that there are controls that I think are more, and I think particularly, as I say, the controls relating to marking of information, the slowdowns to our suppliers, training requirements, things that go beyond the information security system itself and are more broad throughout the organization, to make sure that we're covering those. But it is certainly a codependence on the folks who are managing the system to understand some of the more nuances. But again, I think it helps that this is happening throughout the year and that we have the information security board and can kind of talk to those things and not suddenly trying to understand the controls when DCMA is coming.
Yeah, and on that, I think that's a nice transition really into the assessment itself. And so I'm going to throw this open to the whole group for, their thoughts. I think a lot of the participant or the attendees will be interested in any insights that you can offer and provide us based on your DIBCAC assessment. For example, did you find the auditors sophisticated and knowledgeable about cybersecurity? I know in a lot of places, the industry feels the auditors do not have that sophistication and knowledge. or were there areas of specific focus, your system security plan, CUI marking, CUI, CDI protection, training, flow downs, and, et cetera. So I'll throw that open to whoever wants to take the first bite at that one.
I'll go ahead and I'll lead off on that one. I would say I was very impressed with the auditors. I mean, having been through several business system audits at Viasat and, seeing different levels of auditors, the level of auditors that came in for this particular assessment were very sophisticated. They knew their subject matter very, very well. And they were able to identify gaps. They knew where to look. They knew their stuff, and they came in extremely prepared. They were very respectful. They were very good at time management. In fact, our audit finished earlier than the anticipated time frame. They kept everybody on schedule. At the end of each day, they gave a debrief. They let us know where they were going. There were no surprises along the way. And that took some of the stress out of the audit for us. You have, as Jeff mentioned, we had an Army on hand to support this so that we were ready to go at all times, and that helped also move the audit along quickly. But all in all, as far as an audit can go, it was almost a pleasant experience as far as a business system type audit would go. Certainly better than, easier than a CPSR. Even though CPSRs are challenging, but this one, I anticipated it was going to be harder and more difficult than a CPSR, and that wasn't the case for us.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Sylvia said. Obviously, we went through the same assessment, and to me personally, I found great respect for the auditors. I thought they were well prepared. That they knew what they were talking about. They were ready to come in. Again, they stuck to the schedule, which was great. One of the very few audits that I've ever been to that stuck to the schedule, and I've been through previous PCI and SOX audits and other related frameworks and so on. But yeah, definitely, they knew it, but after going through the assessment, I said, hey, they know what they're doing. I worry about other companies, like especially our supply chain partners. If they were to go through this assessment, are they going to come out with a positive outcome without question? So, and even with that is they knew their stuff. I'd say from some of the stuff they assessed, there was some stuff they went through that I was like, oh, I wish you would have gone in more detail, and they didn't go into that much detail. And maybe that's just because we had it well documented and the policies were tight and the interviewee just hit stuff fast. And then there's other stuff where I thought it would just be a home run and a slam dunk. And it's like they were like, hey, let's get into detail on this. And one particular control that, quite honestly, we thought was just was a home run for us. They dug into some detail and they were like, yeah, the way you have this is not. We don't view it as satisfactory. We were like, hey, we don't agree with you. We wanted to argue it, and not argue in a disrespectful way, but we were bringing up some challenges to it, and they were like, hey, we're not here to provide interpretation. We give a pretty binary answer. If you want to challenge that after the audit, you take it up with the DoD CIO's office. That's your vector. With that being said, we rectified that kind of as they went through. We had some discussions with some other folks for the implementation and so on. So I definitely say that, and again, echo what Sylvia's saying, and it would overall it was pleasant, and probably it was pleasant because we were pretty we were pretty well prepared. If you're not that well prepared, they may not be as pleasant to be with, but I'll just leave it at that.
And I'll just jump in. I think we had some nervousness because of everything we read about kind of DCMA going through a massive recruitment kick for auditors about the level of expertise that the team would have. And we had the same experience that the auditors knew the controls well. There was sort of a hierarchy among the audit team that came to us. There's a lead auditor, and there were some senior folks and some junior folks. So I don't know offhand whether the junior folks had the same level of knowledge, but certainly what was coming through from the lead and the senior auditors showed a good knowledge of the controls. And they really did just kind of tick through the controls, in our experience, one at a time, very systematically, very methodically. And so, it was, we had no issues with knowledge. I think, Jeff mentioned, and we had a similar, there was an issue with the interpretation, but it wasn't a question of knowledge of the controls. It was more of a matter of interpretation of the controls. And that was something that, there's not really an adjudication process in the audit, so we had to leave that for later. But generally, the auditors were very professional, very knowledgeable, and as others said, it ran on schedule, and it was I won't say an easy audit, but a well-run audit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds, from what I'm hearing, that maybe there weren't areas that DCMA, the DIPCAC assessment team tried to surprise you or trip you up. I mean, was that your experience, or did you find that there were some surprises in the process?
They want you to succeed. They give you sort of where they're going. You know what they're looking for, and it's up to you whether you're going to succeed or not based on what you've done to prepare.
I will say the only surprises.
Go ahead.
The only surprises we had, I think, were sort of an artifact of the fact that it went virtual, and there was some kind of a little bit of confusion, I think, in the transition to virtual because we did have a virtual assessment. And so in the lead up to the audit, the agenda was established a little bit late in the game. We got some document requests more in the, about 2 weeks before the audit that we would have liked to have received earlier. And so that's just kind of, I recommend other folks make sure to reach out to DCMA and, if there's any documents they're going to request, make sure that you have those available more in advance, because we'd already done some document pulls and there was a little bit of repetition there. But in the actual audit, absolutely, they were not trying to trip us up. There were no surprises. Everything I think that we found was just in preparation, and again, I think mostly because of COVID throwing a wrench in the process.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that with, there were no surprises, and to be honest, they were even like, hey, you set the schedule. We'll give you a schedule of how we want to roll through it. If you want to flip this around based on your availability and the availability of your stakeholders, just let us know. We'll work with you. The one thing I would add too, almost like as a preparation piece too, is prior to it, you can have as many phone calls with them as you want. If you want to have 15 phone calls with them, you can have 15 phone calls. I think we had like 3 or 4 phone calls. But the one thing that that I asked them when they were here, it was towards the end of the assessment. I asked them, I said, hey, would you be open to even just doing like a test run on some controls prior to you doing an assessment? And they were like, oh yeah, totally. Pick 2 controls, and we're not going to basically assess you at that point, but we'll do a test run, and you can see exactly kind of the methodology that we're going to use, how we're going to go through it. So do that. They'll take 2 or 3 controls and just do like a practice run with you. And they said they were open to doing it, so that was good. So after that, I was like, oh, I wish I would have done that ahead of time, but instead of like game, the first time we're going through the game was when we're already in the game and the first pitch is coming at us.
Yeah, no, I think that's some great insight there. And I wanted to follow up on one point that Elizabeth said, and with the virtual assessment happening, I mean, can you give us some insight on the process, I guess, after that virtual assessment happened? I mean, is there going to be a follow-up in person? Is there continuing communication with DCMA? Can you give us any insight on that?
Yeah, so I can jump in, and I think we've had similar experiences, but we had a virtual high assessment, and so they went through most of the controls, but in our case there were 9 controls that they did not go through and were waiting to come back for an on-site assessment, which in our case is going to happen this June. And so the controls they didn't look at that we still have to go through relate to the media protection, the media marking and protecting media, and then a lot of the physical security controls, the physical protection, visitor escorts, and that sort of thing. And so again, they went through most of them, but they are going to come back, and so we don't have a final score yet. We had feedback from the first part of the audit, but obviously we've done our self-assessment, but it won't be complete until they come back and finish that on-site portion.
Okay, and I guess one, we're running a little close on time on our DIPCAC portion, but I wanted to hit one more question before we move on to CMMC, and that is, has DCMA given you any indication on the scoring? You know, what an acceptable score is, how you should look at your supply chain, and if they have a high-level assessment or even a low-level self-assessment, what an acceptable score is, and has there been any communication in that area?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one first. I've asked that question repeatedly, not just to DCMA, but every other person or entity and group that I work with, and so on and so on. So the answer is no. There is not a standard that says, hey, this is passing, this is fail. Hey, if you score below a 90, that means you failed. So the answer is no. And then, so my next question is well, is there about an average score that everybody's getting? And what was communicated was that it's an average score of about 100. But again, I'll take that with a grain of salt. I don't know. Again, just take that with a grain of salt. And even internally, as we work with our own supply chain partners, we're always like, hey, what should be a good score? It's, I guess we're just ingrained into this like A, B, C mentality. So it's like, oh, if it's about an 80, that's kind of a B, isn't it? It's like kind of close enough. But in this, at least in my own mind, if you're below an 80, I'd be like, oh my God, there's cause for concern. We should definitely be doing some real detailed checks here, and maybe that's even below 90 and so on. So I'll just kind of leave it at that with that answer.
And I'll just jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sylvia.
We were told, thanks, Elizabeth. We were just told that we fell within the average of those that they had assessed. And so we took it as, okay, average for now. We're getting through at the stage we are. We're meeting where we need to be. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was going to say, they didn't really give us much messaging in terms of acceptable score. In terms of the feedback that they gave us after the virtual portion of the audit, it was much more targeted on sort of positive feedback to the extent that we had that any issues they ID'd, we'd already identified. So that, that it was a well-functioning system where we knew what we were doing. We'd already identified the issues that we needed to work on, and that they didn't find anything that we hadn't already identified. So it seemed like their feedback in the particular assessment was less in terms of this is an acceptable or not acceptable score, but was more in terms of that we had effectively identified our POAMs and through our self-assessment. I think we obviously are reaching out to others in the industry and trying to, in other forums, find out what various program offices are viewing as an acceptable score. But we're hearing wildly different things. And, some program offices wanting, perfection, no POAMs, nothing open, and others less so. And so it seems that it's going to vary by program. And we haven't heard any particular messaging from our program office despite our efforts to get that. So it's still pretty open.
And I think the real target here is probably, I know we're going to transition into CMMC discussions, is CMMC doesn't allow a POAM. So our focus right now is to, and even here, we still have something POAM'd, and the intent is figure that we're solving that fast because we don't want anything POAM'd.
Yeah, thanks. I think we could spend, obviously more than the 1-hour CLE webinar we have on this, but I think all of that insight is very valuable for those that have not yet gone through, the reviews. And so, but before we transition to CMMC, which Jeff set up greatly, I just wanted to mention, as I did at the beginning of the webinar, that we need to take a brief moment to satisfy the CLE requirements by delivering the following code word. So all New York and New Jersey licensed attorneys must type in the code word safeguard into the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your webinar screen. Make sure that you hit the send button so that it registers. And in case you missed it the first time, the code word is safeguard. So, transitioning to slides there, CMMC. Phil, I guess the next cybersecurity compliance requirement in the pipeline is CMMC. Can you provide the quick overview of the rule and the risks that you see in it? And also, one of the Q&As that we got was for a quick rehashing of what led to the rules. So if you can, cover that quickly also.
Sure. And I also noticed in the Q&A, there was a question about how they're going to pick which DIPCAP assessment is going to apply. I think, the basic applies across the board. Everybody's got to do a basic. And then the government's going to decide whether to do medium or high. And then they'll augment what's an SPRS with your results, basically. But you populate your own self-assessment at the basic level. And I think it's going to be a risk-based analysis by DoD as to who they're going to target. And then it's going to be sort of similar to CPSRs in terms of a rolling 3-year. That does take us to CMMC to the extent that at least my intuition tells me that the DIPTAC assessments are going to mature into something different once CMMC is in place and we've got these certifications. It seems like there are two different methodologies for the government to accomplish the same thing, which is to assess how well the contractor and the supply chain has implemented the security controls required under the DFARS clause. CMMC really came onto the scene in, I think it was June 2019 or so, and then there was a big, long period of time where there was a bunch of public meetings and information gathering and so on to come up with the framework. But what we've ended up with is a 5-level maturity model, basically, with level 1 corresponding to essentially the 15 basic safeguarding requirements from the FAR clause. Level 2 adds more, and then level 3 gets you to on par with the NIST 800-171 requirements plus 20 CMMC practices and 3 CMMC processes. So it's more than 800-171, but level 3 and 800-171 have been viewed as sort of analogs to each other. And then level 4 and 5 is when you get into, a system that needs to be able to deal with advanced persistent threats and other types of, much more sophisticated actors, and therefore requires the system to be much more capable. And the table here identifies sort of the additional rigor that comes along with level 4 and level 5. These are going to be identified in the solicitations, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to see in the chat if anybody has been the lucky recipient of a solicitation that includes a CMMC requirement as a go, no-go decision on contract award. But under the rule that's been published, you will see 252-204-7021 if the contract has been designated as subject to CMMC. And while the plan is that that's going to be rolled out through to September 30th, 2025, once we get to that date, then basically anything that is over the micro purchase threshold and is not COTS is going to be subject to the requirement, and it's going to then also flow down to every single subcontractor in the supply chain. Basically, everybody, 220,000 or so entities are going to need to get some level of CMMC certification, and the CMMC Accreditation Board has already issued guidance on level 1 and level 3. And I think that there are some private assessors, the C3POs, and others that are doing assessments as we speak. I don't know if any on the panel have encountered this or not in terms of being in a solicitation yet, but it's coming. So Tyler, with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, and so we're near the end of our time. So to close this out, I guess I'll just throw the question to the panel of what are some of the steps that you're taking to prepare for CMMC, within your own company and your supply chain, and And, I guess as Phil asked also, have you seen the requirements in any of your contracts yet?
I'll go ahead and lead off. We have not seen the requirement for the 7021 clause in any of our contracts yet, although many of the, in situations where we're working with primes, they are certainly pressing us very hard to be ready for the 7021 clause. What I can say is the number one thing that we're doing to prepare for CMMC is if you have, besides understanding your controls and being able to document your policies and processes, you really have to have a good handle on CUI. If you don't have a good handle in your CUI, which is very easy to do without the, is very difficult to do right now, given that the government guidance hasn't come out yet and the government hasn't done a good job in marking CUI. But, try and do your best to get a good assessment of where your CUI is, and that way you will be able to minimize the portions of your network under scrutiny for CMMC, and you'll be able to minimize the impact to your supply base. That's my parting words of wisdom.
Yeah, I think, for us, obviously, we're looking at going through a gap assessment where we do have POAMs, trying to close those. We're trying to figure out if we're going to be a level 3 or 4. It's obviously a gap assessment on those differences between the NIST 800-171 and the level 4 controls. But then also working with our customer, trying to, as Sylvia mentioned, get a better handle on what their interpretation in terms of what CUI. We work with a lot of export control information, and so, for our heritage information that supports multiple different contracts, we're trying to get a better definition from our customer in terms of where they view the CUI kind of starting and stopping. But in the meantime, just working with our supply base to make sure everyone is working towards an understanding of these controls. As Phil mentioned, even the folks that are not receiving CUI are going to have to have some level of certification. So we've got very sophisticated suppliers who are very much on top of this, and then we've got a lot of suppliers who are not your traditional defense contractors, and just trying to socialize with them the notion that some level of cybersecurity is required. And there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where we don't necessarily know and can't necessarily tell all of our suppliers yet what level they're going to have to be certified at. And so it's going to be an evolving process as we understand the regulations more and get that sort of CUI more buttoned down. But in the meantime, getting questionnaires out there, socializing with them, making sure that everyone is understanding that there's a minimum going to be certain basic controls, and anyone who's got CUI needs to be working towards full compliance and trying to get those smaller folks and make sure that we know where they are, so that when we don't have it on contract yet, but so when we get it on contract, our suppliers are going to be in a position to be certified.
Yeah, and I know we're at time, and I just want to bring up one last point that was talked about with the C3 PAOs, or the Certified Third-Party Assessment Organizations, definitely. Most recently, I've started reaching out to some of these C3 PAOs because I want to know from them. It's like, hey, can you actually do certifications? To my understanding, they can't do certifications because I don't think there's a single C3 PAO, although I don't want to make that blanket statement. I don't think, I'll just say most of them have not gone through a DIBCAC assessment, so they in turn can't then go start certifying other organizations. I'm told that they'll be going through those this summer, at least with the ones I've talked to. But like I said, I've just kind of started cold calling them. I want to understand what they're doing. I want to understand how we start integrating with them, what they can do in terms of consulting and then certifying us. And they can't do both. They can only do like a consulting and help with you with implementation, or do the actual certification. Although they're telling me that they're starting to build like ecosystems for companies that they may partner with and recommend, and so on and so on. So it's definitely evolving out there. For now, definitely work on those CMMC practices and get those implemented. Definitely the registered practitioner organizations, or the RPOs as it's been dubbed, they can provide, some consultant work. Definitely do your homework if you seek to, contract with one of those companies. I'm sure some are better than others. There's a ton of them on the CMMC marketplace. So do your homework as you're doing it, because it's, just because someone's an RPO doesn't mean that they're like a certified CMMC expert. Really all it takes is to become an RPO to a certain extent is paying paying some money so you can get shown up on the website and so on. And I'm not taking anything away from anyone, but just do your homework as you work with these companies and so on.
All right. Well, we are at our time, so I just want to thank everyone for attending today, and a special thank you to all of our panelists. Our next Dentons Academy webinar will cover ethical and compliance rules that apply to the federal government marketplace, and hopefully will be eligible for an ethics credit. That webinar is going to be on Thursday, May 6th, and we hope you will join us. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And thanks, everyone, one last time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.